swamp thick with shadows. A deaf 4-year-old girl trembles beneath the hiss of a venomous snake. But instead of a scream, a tiny bell rings. And through the dark, a white horse appears, like a spirit. No neigh, no sound, just standing between her and the wind, the poison, and something far more monstrous. Subscribe now, and don't miss a single story that dares to break your heart and heal it again. Under the vast Texas sky, before the sun even dared to rise fully, the prairie breathed a kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but waiting. A low wind swirled through the tall grass, brushing over the earth like a lullaby no one remembered. And somewhere in that endless field, a sound rose small, tender, and misplaced. Ting, ting, ting. A tiny brass bell no larger than a walnut clung gently from a faded blue ribbon around the neck of a child. It didn't scream for attention. It didn't cry for help. It simply existed, soft, rhythmic, persistent. And miles away, near a fence eaten by time and rust, a white mare lifted her head. Luna, her ears flicked forward. Nostrils flared. That sound. That impossible sound. The mare stood still, as stone eyes fixed on the horizon, where the wind carried the faint ringing like an echo of a memory she wasn't sure was hers. 4-year-old Harper sat in the dirt with her legs folded underneath her. Her overalls were stained with mud, her fingers chalked with dust. Her little hands moved carefully as she dragged a stick across the ground, sketching something she didn't have the words to describe. A horse, or what she believed a horse looked like. Big, gentle, watching. Around her neck, the bell swayed with every subtle movement she made. It was old, so old the shine had dulled into a melancholy matte. But it was the only thing she had from her. The woman from the picture. The one she didn't remember, but dreamed of often. Harper's ears, framed by unruly blonde curls, bore 2 hearing aids worn and barely working. One had stopped functioning entirely 2 months ago. The other buzzed like a broken radio. But she wore them anyway. She didn't know silence could have a sound until the machines began to fail. Now the world felt heavier. Her drawing almost finished, Harper looked up. Her eyes were big and blue, oceanic, too ancient for her age. She glanced toward the creaking screen door of the small cabin, a structure half swallowed by weeds and disuse. Inside, a man sat in a wooden chair staring at the barrel of a rusted shotgun as if it held answers. Walter, her grandfather. He hadn't always been like this, neighbors once whispered. Long before the oil dried up and the cattle vanished. Long before his daughter, the only person he ever truly looked at, disappeared. But grief is a shapeshifter. In Walter, it took the form of stillness, coldness, silence. This morning he stood with the stiffness of old decisions hardened into bone. He walked to the porch, the boards groaning beneath his weight. Looked at Harper. Didn't call her name. Just nodded toward the barn. She rose, quietly, obediently. She did not ask questions. Walter didn't answer questions. The barn smelled of dry hay and sweat-stained leather. Flies buzzed lazily, uninterested in the scene. Walter lifted Harper onto the wooden seat of a small wagon, the kind once used to haul fencing supplies. The reins were cracked but functional. The old bay mare pulling the cart snorted as if sensing the tension in Walter's hands. He didn't buckle Harper in. Didn't offer a blanket. Just pressed a paper bag into her lap. Inside, a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper. No words. Walter climbed up beside her, and for a moment the wind died down. Harper turned to look at him, a flicker of something, hope, maybe dancing in her expression. But he didn't meet her gaze. Instead, he clicked his tongue, and the cart jerked forward. The journey stretched in silence. Dust kicked up behind the wheels, catching the morning light like ash. Harper didn't know where they were going. She only knew this route wasn't familiar. Past the old cattle pens, beyond the windmill skeletons, into the wetlands where the earth grew soft and the air smelled like decay and forgotten things. Harper held the paper bag tighter. The cart stopped abruptly. Walter climbed down first, looked around. Shrubs, mud, swamp grass, no signs, no paths. He reached up and lifted Harper down. Not roughly, not gently, just functionally. Then for the first time, he did something unexpected. He knelt. He brushed a strand of hair from Harper's face. His hand lingered longer than necessary. His eyes, bloodshot gray and hard, searched hers, and then he stood. Without a word, he turned, climbed back onto the cart, clicked his tongue. The mare hesitated. Walter snapped the reins harder. The cart turned. The sound of the wheels grew softer, then vanished. Harper stood alone. The air changed, thicker, damp. Trees leaned too close, the kind of place where things slithered and watched. The sun slipped behind low clouds, and suddenly the warmth of morning felt like a lie. She looked down at the paper bag, still unopened. The bell around her neck tinkled. Once. Twice. It was a lonely sound in that silence, like someone knocking gently on a door no one would open. She didn't cry, not then. Instead, she sat back down on the edge of a moss-covered stone and opened her bag. Took a small bite of the sandwich. She chewed slowly, the eyes locked on the nothing ahead. Far off, something stirred. Luna hadn't moved in 5 minutes. Her breath shallow, her ears trained forward. That sound again. She stepped closer to the fence, her hooves heavy with memory. No one had worn that bell since. Her eyes flashed. Luna trotted forward past the fences, past the safe, dry land hooves, slicing into muddy grass. The bell's vibration wasn't loud, but it throbbed in her bones. Harper looked up as she felt the earth rumble slightly beneath her. Branches snapped. Then out of the dense green, Luna appeared. Not galloping, not charging. Just there, a white ghost against the swamp dark. Harper's eyes widened. She didn't scream, didn't move. The mare approached slowly, breath steaming in the cool shade. Her coat was flecked with scars. One eye was clouded with age, or pain, or both. But she was majestic, even if time had tried to erase it. Luna stopped a few feet away, lowered her head. Harper stood. She reached out. The bell on her neck swayed once more. Luna closed the distance. Their foreheads almost touched. In that moment, no sound was needed. No voice, no words, just presence, just understanding. The sun tried again to break through the clouds. A ray of light slipped between leaves and fell across Harper's back and Luna's mane. Wind picked up slightly, and the bell rang again. But this time it wasn't a call for help. It was an answer. Under the rust-tinted skies of a Texas dusk, the world stood on the edge of silence, thick with the sound of things that did not want to be heard. The sun, already weary from its climb, began its descent behind the tree line, like an old truth retreating into shadows. At the bow's edge, near a barbed wire fence swallowed by kudzu and years of neglect, Luna grazed. Her coat, once the color of milk, had dulled from wind and rain. Scars ran across her side like quiet stories no one had asked her to tell. Her ribs, though still strong, showed the wear of loss. She moved slowly, deliberately, not like prey, but like something that had learned the art of surviving sorrow. The grass at her feet trembled gently, not from wind, something else. Tink, tink, tink. The sound barely floated in like a breath whispered through iron. But Luna's ears flicked one, then the other, like the twin hands of a clock turning toward memory. Her head rose. She stilled. The strand of clover dangling from her mouth dropped to the dirt. She knew that sound, or no, she felt it. Somewhere between her ears and her bones, in a place grief had once carved. Open it landed and pulsed, like the faint heartbeat of something that should have been lost. Luna took one step forward, her hooves pressing deeper into soft mud, then another, and another. She left her patch of safety and slipped into the trees. Meanwhile, Harper sat alone in the belly of the wetland, the air now thick with bugs and the sickly breath of standing water. Her small body trembled not from cold, but from confusion and dread. The ground beneath her had turned into sponge. Each shift of her weight sank her slightly lower into the marsh. Her left shoe had already vanished in a pool of black water sucked under, like it never existed. She tried to stay still, but her body was betraying her legs, twitching. Teeth chattering, hands covered in welts from the mosquito bites that layered her skin like raised dots in a braille language of misery. And then the unmistakable slither. She froze. A thin shadow, a line of motion no longer than a pencil, glided past the heel of her exposed foot. The snake, a water moccasin, indifferent and perfect, slid through the reeds with a kind of evil grace that belonged only to creatures who had no concept of fear. It missed her by inches, but Harper didn't know that. All she knew was the feeling in her belly, a knot that twisted hard. She bit down on her wrist to keep from screaming. The bell around her neck, almost weightless, before now felt like a burden. It swung once as she moved her shoulders in reflex. One soft chime. That was all it took. Luna heard it again. This time she moved faster, through thick brush, over old roots, along paths beaten by deer and forgotten men. The sun now cracked through the canopy like leaking bloodlight, slanting in wide orange blades. Her hooves thudded against damp earth, sure strong without hesitation. She didn't whinny. She didn't call. Some part of her understood instinctively whatever made that sound was small, vulnerable, and frightened. That sound did not need to be answered with noise. It needed to be found, and as she ran, another sound crawled from her past. A colt's cry. Thin, sharp, unfinished. She had given birth during the season when the rains refused to stop. The colt had been small, but healthy. Beautiful. He had her eyes. 3 days after birth, he disappeared. Luna had searched run herself. Raw, kicked apart fences, screamed through forests until her voice broke in half. When they finally found the body, it was coiled in the sharp metal mouth of a bait trap, left by a rancher who hadn't walked that part of the field in months. The colt had suffered, alone. That was the part she never stopped smelling. And now, this bell. Same pitch, same haunting. But it wasn't her child. She smelled girl. She smelled fear, blood, swamp, and something else. A scent she didn't have a name for. But it clung to the air like a ghost. Harper blinked slowly. Her breathing was shallow, controlled in the way only children who've learned to survive fear understand. Her knees pressed to her chest, one arm wrapped tight around them, the other hand gripping the small brass bell at her throat as if holding it still would make her invisible. And then, rustling, heavy, deliberate, near. She turned her head slightly, expecting more danger. But what emerged from the veil of trees was not what the swamp had promised. A horse, white, towering, silent. Its breath steamed into the dusk. Hooves wide and dark with mud. Its eyes were unreadable, one partially clouded, the other sharp with alertness. Harper didn't move. Her lips parted a small gasp, forming but no sound escaped. Luna stood there, chest rising and falling. The bell had brought her this far. Now she waited. For what? Recognition, permission, forgiveness. Harper's lower lip quivered. Slowly, hesitantly, she raised her hand. Not fast, not threatening. A movement born from the same silence she lived in. Her palm met the mare's muzzle. Luna didn't flinch. Instead, she closed her eyes, and something passed between them. Something ancient and primal. Beyond speech, beyond species. A child who had been abandoned. A mother who had lost her young. Two souls built from the same fracture. Harper took a shaky step forward. Her knees buckled slightly, but Luna shifted just enough for the child to steady herself on her broad side. Then, with a grace that defied her size, Luna dropped to her knees. Front legs first slow and careful, her head low to the ground. She was offering something. Sanctuary, shelter, a womb made of breath and bone. Harper did not hesitate. She crawled beneath the arch of Luna's chest, between her front legs, and sat cradled in shadow, wrapped in heat, the bell at her neck now pressed against Luna's beating heart. Above them, the last rays of sun dragged long shadows across the bog, bending Luna's form into a towering silhouette against the dying light. She looked like a cathedral, a beast-shaped chapel of mercy. She kept still, vigilant, listening, smelling. And Harper, for the first time in hours, closed her eyes, not because she was giving up, but because she finally could. The wild rumbled around them. A bullfrog barked. Insects trilled. The swamp whispered the kinds of secrets it never intended for men to hear. And in the middle of it all, a child beneath a horse, a bell between two hearts, a silence that didn't hurt. Far away, the man who had left her stood at his sink, washing blood from his fingers, the blood of a bird he'd hunted out of season and without purpose. The water ran brown, then red, then clear again. He didn't notice. He never looked up, didn't hear the bell, didn't feel its pull, but somewhere, maybe in the part of him he had long since buried, something twitched. A muscle, a memory, a mercy. Then it passed. He went back to drying his hands. Back in the marsh, Harper shifted in her cocoon of horse and shadow. She pressed her face against Luna's chest and smiled into the mare's skin. Not because she was safe yet, not because she was warm, but because, for the first time, she wasn't alone. And somehow, even if she didn't hear it, didn't need to hear it, the bell chimed once more. It sounded like grace. Under the copper-tinted sky, far from where Luna cradled Harper beneath her warm chest. A boy sat atop a rusted water trough, watching the world through a pair of binoculars too big for his face. His elbows rested on his knees, steadying the lenses, his bare feet dangling over the edge, coated in a fine crust of dirt ash and the unspoken language of abandonment. His name was Mason. 9 years old by birth certificate, if that paper still existed anywhere, but older by the calendar of loneliness. The binoculars were cracked down one lens, duct-taped in two places. But they worked. Well enough. Through them, Mason scanned the open land. Not for fun, not for wonder, for threat, for food, for anything that moved. Behind him, 6 dogs of no particular breed or pedigree lounged near a collapsed barn wall, chewing on bones, napping in the shade, swatting flies with twitching tails. They were his pack. He had no brothers, no parents, no neighbors. But he had them. And in return for his scraps of food and whispered stories, they stayed. Mason saw the world the way feral things do, never trusting it to stay still, never believing it would be kind. He lowered the binoculars for a second, scratched the side of his jaw where a mosquito bite had raised an angry welt, then lifted the lenses again. Movement, just beyond the bog line. In the worst stretch of marsh, a place even coyotes avoided. He narrowed his eyes. A flash of white. A figure. No two. He adjusted the focus. The lens sharpened. A horse. And beneath it, A girl. A small girl barely more than a baby, curled under the animal's chest, clutching something shiny against her neck. Mason's breath hitched. Then the lens began to shake. Not from the wind, from his hands. He yanked the binoculars down, blinked, rubbed his eyes, looked again. Still there, the horse-massive silence stood over the girl like a shield forged from muscle and memory. Around them, the swamp coiled snakes in the water shadows in the grass. "No one's supposed to be out there," he whispered. "Not and still be alive." But the girl was. The girl was. And Mason knew what he was about to do, even before the dogs began to stir. He darted into the barn, tossing aside a rotted tarp, until he found what he needed. A length of rope, a flashlight, and a half loaf of bread stolen from the back porch of the diner 3 nights earlier. He stuffed the bread into a canvas bag, slung it over his shoulder, and shoved the flashlight into his back pocket. Then, he wheeled out his bike from under a pile of sheet metal, checking the tires with a slap. One was almost flat. Didn't matter. "Stay here," he told the dogs. One whined, another barked low. "I mean it." And then he was off. The bike creaked with every turn of the pedal. The wheels bit into gravel and sand and patches of mud. And still he rode harder, faster. Wind screamed past his ears. Sweat dripped from his forehead, stung his eyes. But he didn't blink, didn't flinch. He knew the trails, the shortcuts, the dangerous dips he could launch off of without flipping. This wasn't the first time he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to, but it was the first time it looked like someone needed him. When he reached the outer edge of the bog, he dropped the bike and continued on foot. His sneakers, hole-riddled and reeking, sank into the mud with every step. Twigs sliced at his calves. Insects buzzed in his ears. A cloud of gnats swarmed his mouth. Still he pressed forward. The sound of the bell grew closer. Not loud, not insistent, just present, like it was waiting for him. And then through a veil of cattails and knee-high grass, he saw them. The horse stood still. The girl beneath it didn't move. Mason froze 20 feet away, heart thundering. He didn't want to spook them. The horse could run. The girl might scream. But then he remembered she hadn't screamed. Not once. She hadn't even flinched when surrounded by snakes. He took a slow step forward, then another. Luna's head turned. Her eye, the clear one, locked onto his. She didn't move, didn't retreat. Just watched. Mason whispered, "Hey." The girl shifted slightly. "Hey," he said again a little louder. "I ain't gonna hurt you, I swear." He took another step, then crouched, hands visible. The girl blinked at him. Her eyes were wet, her face smudged with mud and fear. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. Mason understood. She couldn't. He reached into his bag and pulled out the bread. Tore a piece. Ate it, showing her it was safe. Then offered a slice. Slowly, she reached out and took it. And just like that, the distance between them shrank. Luna exhaled. Mason approached with reverence, like he was entering church. When he was close enough, he touched the girl's shoulder. Still nothing. Then he nodded toward the trees. "Come on," he said. "Let's get out of here." She didn't stand. Instead, she looked up at the horse. Luna bent her head low, brushed her nose against the girl's cheek. And Harper, because that was her name, though. Mason didn't know it yet. Rose slowly, pulling herself up, using the mare's shoulder like a walker. Mason reached out a hand. Harper took it. Together, they started back toward the path. Luna followed, not because she was being led, because she chose to. By the time they reached the edge of the clearing, the sun had vanished behind a quilt of storm-colored clouds. Dusk had arrived. Mason grabbed his bike, slung the rope around his shoulder, and pointed toward the direction he'd come. "You can ride," he said, more to the horse than the girl. But Luna didn't move, so they walked. 3 figures, boy, girl, horse, moving through the fading light, like a forgotten tribe returning from exile. It took over an hour to reach the old ranch. Mason pushed open this broken gate and guided them toward the main barn. The dogs barked at first, deep warning growls, but when they saw the girl and the horse, they fell silent. One of them, a one-eyed mutt named Jasper, approached Luna cautiously. The horse dipped her head, sniffed, then gently bumped the dog's side. It was enough. The dogs backed off. Harper collapsed on a pile of hay sacks. Her fingers still clutched a scrap of bread untouched since the bog. Mason knelt beside her, trying to figure out what to say, what to ask, but her eyes said everything. So he said nothing. Instead, he grabbed an old blanket, shook out the dust, and draped it over her. Luna lay down beside her, not in the corner, not by the wall, but right next to the child. Harper curled into her like she'd done it 1,000 times before. Mason sat across from them, back against the barn post, legs stretched out. The dogs settled in a loose circle, as if forming a silent perimeter. No one spoke, but the silence wasn't empty. It was full of questions unasked, fears shared, trust earned not by words, but by presence. That night, the wind howled across the plains. The barn groaned. Rain danced on the metal roof in waves. But inside, a girl who had been discarded. A horse who had lost her child. And a boy no one had remembered. All slept beneath the same ceiling, unseen, uncounted, but not alone. And somewhere in that space between breath and sleep, the bell rang again. Just once. Soft. Sure, a chime of recognition. Under the battered tin roof of the abandoned cattle barn, the night breathed softly, moaning through slats in the wood, rattling loose nails like old secrets begging to be told. A low lantern flickered from a hook Mason had bolted to a beam weeks ago, casting long golden light that barely reached the corners. Dust hung suspended in the air, glittering in that glow like something sacred. Mason sat cross-legged on the barn floor, Harper in front of him, on an old milk crate, her shoulders trembling from the wet cold still clinging to her skin. The silence between them was complete, but not hollow. It was expectant, tentative. Beside them, a small pot of boiled rainwater sat cooling. Mason had warmed it over the portable camping stove he'd scavenged from a roadside dumpster 2 winters ago. It only had one working burner, but it did the job. Gently, he dipped the rag in the water. His hands weren't steady. Not from fear, but something else. Something that had settled inside his ribs the moment he saw her under the horse's chest in the swamp. A kind of duty. Not responsibility, devotion. He wrung out the cloth and brought it to Harper's cheek. She flinched. "Hey," Mason said softly. "It's okay." He showed her the rag. Dipped it again. Wiped it across his own face with a grin. Then slowly, she leaned forward. He began to clean the dirt from her jaw, her nose the crease of her neck where mud had dried into flaky rivers. Her face, though still etched in exhaustion, began to appear through the grime, delicate, bruised by the world, but whole. Her hands clutched the frayed blanket he'd wrapped around her, like it was stitched from armor. Luna stood in the doorway, not inside, not outside, just there. Her white coat a contrast to the blue night behind her, her eyes unblinking, watching, guarding. Mason glanced at the mare, and then back to Harper. He didn't know the words for what was forming, but he knew it wasn't temporary. The next morning, when the world was still silver with dew, Mason woke to the sound of soft scratching. He rubbed his eyes and sat up on his makeshift cot. Harper sat near the stall wall, her fingers moving slowly across the dust-covered wooden plank. She was drawing. Mason crept closer and peered over her shoulder. A horse, Luna, with a girl tucked under her chest, and a boy standing nearby holding what looked like a loaf of bread. He laughed once. Just air, no noise. Then he tapped her shoulder. She looked up. He pressed his fist against his chest, then opened it outward. "Thank you," in the sign language from the worn paperback he'd taught himself to read months ago. Harper blinked. Then her face softened into something he hadn't seen before. She smiled. Her first one. Mason felt like the roof of the barn might lift. Days passed like pages of a book they were writing without a pen. Quiet, slow, vivid. In the mornings, Harper drew. Sometimes Luna. Sometimes Mason. Once she drew a woman, tall, dark hair, with the same small bell Harper wore. She didn't offer an explanation. Mason didn't ask, but the picture stayed tucked inside a wooden slat near his bed. At noon, they scavenged. Mason showed her how to gather wild onions, how to rinse rainwater through cloth, how to tell the difference between coyote prints and those of a feral hog. She watched him closely, mimicked his motions, laughed once when he tripped over his own feet and landed in a blackberry bush. That night she drew the bush, with him in it. Luna grazed during the days, wandered the outer perimeter, but always returned by nightfall. She would stand in the barn doorway like a statue sculpted from dusk. She never wandered far, never let Harper from her sight for long. The dogs had accepted her completely now. Jasper even curled up beside her legs during naps. One night under a full moon so bright, it lit the world like a secret exposed, Mason and Harper climbed to the hayloft. Luna remained below her breath, rising in little puffs of fog. Mason passed her the binoculars. She held them backward at first. He chuckled, flipped them around for her, and pointed toward the horizon. There, he whispered. "That's where the city is. You see the blinking lights?" She nodded. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the lights flicker. Then Mason reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pad of paper and a pencil. He wrote, "Do you talk?" She read it, then took the pencil, wrote in unsure letters, "I don't hear, only a little." He looked at her, not with pity, but with admiration. Then he flipped to the next page. "That's okay. I don't talk much anyway." She smiled. They built a language. Quiet and makeshift. A blend of gestures, facial expressions, small drawings, nods, touches. It wasn't polished. It didn't need to be. Each evening, Harper rang the bell at her neck once before bed. A new ritual, not a cry. A song. Luna would nuzzle her shoulder afterward, breathing slow and deep. Mason watched this pattern form, like something ancient being reborn. The bell, once a signal of abandonment, now pulsed with life. It rang in rhythm with their days. 1 chime when food was ready. 2 when danger approached. 3 when Mason found something cool, a feather, a coin, a spoon. It became a heartbeat. But even in peace, suspicion grew like a weed. One afternoon, Mason returned from the backwoods with a bucket of blackberries and found Harper sleeping in the straw with the bell clutched to her chest. He sat nearby staring at her. His thoughts turned. Where had she come from? Why hadn't anyone come looking for her? A girl that small, in a swamp, alone. No accident ends like that. He looked at Luna resting nearby. Her body relaxed, but her ears twitching. Mason rose and stepped outside. Kicked a rock hard enough it ricocheted off the side of the barn. He'd seen cruelty. He'd been discarded too, but this felt deeper. Someone had meant for her not to come back, and suddenly everything inside him turned cold. That evening, after Harper fell asleep beside Luna, Mason paced the barn. Jasper followed him, tail wagging low. What if she's running from something worse than the swamp, Mason whispered to no one. What if she's not safe here? He looked down at Harper's drawing, her and Luna under the sun, with him holding bread. The paper trembled in his fingers. He didn't know the answers, but he knew one thing. Whatever she was running from, she didn't have to run alone anymore. He folded the drawing, pressed it to his chest, and whispered into the silence. I got you. Outside, the wind picked up, and somewhere in the night, the bell rang once. A tiny chime. No fear, just presence. The night broke open with a sound that didn't belong, wood on wood, sharp and urgent. Not the wind. Not the creak of a beam under its own weight. Something intentional. Harper jolted upright in the dark. The barn lay in heavy silence, except for the sound of scratching. Not small like a rat. It was larger. Rhythmic. She looked around. The lantern had burned low, casting dim orange arcs that barely reached the floor. Her hands fumbled for the bell on her neck. Not to ring it, just to feel something real. The scratching came again, this time closer. Luna stood near the far corner, her massive body outlined by shadow. One of her hooves dug against the floorboard. Hard. Then again, and again. Harper climbed off the hay mattress, walked barefoot across the cold wood, and approached. Luna didn't move. She pawed again twice in rapid succession, then stopped. Her head lowered. Her nostrils flared toward the slats in the floor. Harper dropped to her knees. She pressed her hands to the ground and listened with her skin. A cold draft whispered from between the planks. She began to feel around. One board, then another, and then loose. She froze. Luna exhaled long and low, like the letting out of something she'd carried too long. Harper pried at the board. It gave with a groan. Underneath, wrapped in a discolored rag, was a metal chain. Thin, rusted, still intact. She lifted it with both hands. From the folds came a small round pendant, silver, once now tarnished into gray. Etched on the surface were 2 letters, R.E. Harper stared, then brought it to her nose. Breathed in, paused. Something flickered behind her eyes. Luna leaned down and did the same. In the silence that followed, no bell rang, only the sound of recognition. Mason returned from the water pump 10 minutes later, arms soaked to the elbow, shirt damp from a splash. He entered the barn shaking his head like a dog, then stopped cold. Harper was still by the hole. Mason's eyes narrowed. He walked over, saw the open board, saw the necklace in her hands. Where'd you get that? He asked before remembering she couldn't hear him. Harper looked up. She didn't try to explain. She just held the pendant toward him. He took it slowly, turned it over in his palm, read the initials. His mind kicked. Letters, initials, like a signature carved into a fading wall. R.E. The letters bounced around in his brain like marbles down a slope. Familiar. Too familiar. He dropped into a crouch, pulled his pack closer, and dug out a yellowed envelope he'd stolen from the trash behind the town's clinic months ago. He hadn't opened it then. Didn't think it mattered. Now he unfolded the page. Patient notes. Fragments of history. A list of people the town had forgotten. At the bottom, scribbled almost carelessly, Regina Ellis, 28. Deaf. Daughter missing. Presumed runaway. Child Harper Ellis, 4. Grandfather Walter Ellis. Mason felt his skin go cold. He looked from the paper to the pendant, then to Harper, then back to the pendant. R.E., he said aloud. His voice sounded foreign to him. He looked at the girl. You're not just some kid someone lost in the woods. Harper didn't understand his words, but she felt the shift. The electricity in the air, the weight behind his stare. She crawled back to Luna and pressed her head to the mare's side. Luna didn't flinch. She simply blinked, and in that blink, Mason understood something he hadn't before. Luna knew, not with words, with body, with memory, with pain. She'd been there, maybe not at the act itself. But she'd known the woman whose scent still clung faintly to the silver locket. The woman whose absence Harper wore like a second skin. The barn didn't feel safe anymore. It felt like a crime scene, long cleaned, but never healed. Mason sat back on his heels, staring at the loose floorboard, like it was a wound that had reopened under his feet. He had to move. He stood paced to the far end of the barn and leaned against the post. Harper watched him, waiting. Mason had never been someone's protector before. He'd been a scavenger, a shadow of face, in a world that never bothered to learn his name. But now he held a piece of something bigger. And it wasn't just about Harper. It was about the woman who disappeared, the grandfather who pretended she didn't, and the horse who refused to forget. Later that night, Harper fell asleep clutching the pendant. Luna stood watch as always. Mason sat at the edge of the barn doors, a stick in his hand, etching shapes into the dirt. He wasn't drawing. He was planning. Walter Ellis had lied. And Mason, for the first time in his short, wild life, wasn't going to let it stand. Morning came with a low fog and the sound of rain on the roof. Harper stirred groggy, but peaceful. Mason didn't sleep. He'd spent the night thinking, remembering every time he'd watched adults walk past children like they were background noise. Every time the town turned its head. Every time someone whispered troublemaker about him, he'd believe them. Until now. Until Harper. Until the bell and the pendant and the mare with the memory of a mother. Luna walked to the edge of the field that afternoon, standing still, head tilted, like she expected someone. Mason joined her. "She was yours, wasn't she?" he asked. No answer, but her ears flicked. That was enough. Back inside, Harper added to her drawings. This time, the woman with the pendant stood between her and the horse. And the boy, he wasn't holding bread anymore. He was holding her hand. The house sat like a scar on the edge of the land, slumped against the horizon, with its windows blank and unspeaking. Weeds clawed at its foundation, reclaiming what was never truly theirs. The front porch sagged in the middle like a man with a broken back, and the door creaked on its hinges, not out of age, but warning. Mason stood just beyond the fence line, heart pounding hard enough he could hear it in his ears. The dogs hadn't followed this time. He'd told them to stay. This was something he had to do alone. It had rained 2 days ago. The earth beneath his feet was soft, still holding footprints not his own. A boot print, deep and wide. Fresh. Walter was home. Mason's hands tightened around the straps of his canvas backpack. Inside a flashlight, a small notepad, a pocket knife, and Harper's drawing of the pendant. That last one he didn't bring for clues. He brought it for courage. He waited until dusk fell. Shadows spreading like spilled ink across the land. When the last of the light dipped behind the trees, Mason crept up the porch steps, each groan of wood beneath his feet loud enough to spike his nerves. He didn't knock. He slipped through the back. Inside, the air was heavy, sour, like mold and rage had fermented in the walls. The kitchen was empty. A single plate in the sink crusted with food. An ashtray on the table overfull. A shotgun leaned against the wall just beneath the window. Mason's breath hitched. He moved carefully. Every footstep measured. Through the kitchen, into the hallway, to the door that was always shut. Harper's room. He didn't go inside. Not yet. He had another destination. The basement. The stairs creaked in protest as he descended. The smell thickened earth and rot and something iron. He flicked on his flashlight, its beam cutting through dust. The space was lined with old hunting gear traps, ropes, rusted tools. But what caught Mason's eye was the workbench. Covered in papers, notebooks, jars filled with nails and teeth. He approached. A notebook lay open. Its pages filled with tight, cramped handwriting. He read trap locations, types of bait, seasons, success rates, and then one line scrawled in red. Accidental spring near fence post. Regina fatal wounds. No witnesses. Blamed weather. Mason blinked. The page didn't move. He kept reading. Another line. Kept the girl. Couldn't let the law take both. His stomach dropped. He flipped further. Sketches of trap layouts. One resembled the same area he'd pulled Harper from. Nearby, a scribbled map of the bog, marked with X's. Not all of them were for animals. He closed the notebook, hands shaking. Then something fluttered from the rafters above. He looked up. An envelope, taped to the beam, dust-covered. He reached for it. Inside, a photograph. Old, wrinkled, 3 figures. A young woman. Dark hair, unruly eyes, bright wild. A little girl in her arms no older than 2, and a white mare behind them, nuzzling the girl's cheek. Harper, her mother, and Luna. Mason sat on the cold concrete floor, the photo in one hand, the notebook in the other. He couldn't breathe. Walter hadn't just abandoned Harper. He had silenced her. The only witness to what happened to her mother. A hunting accident tucked inside a lie. And that bell around Harper's neck, it wasn't a gift. It was a tether. A reminder. A token from a daughter dead by his negligence, or worse. Mason stood, rage rising like bile. He had to get out before Walter came back. Back at the barn, Harper sat under a lantern glow, sketching again. Her fingers worked fast, guided by instinct and emotion. This time her lines were deeper, more certain. She drew a woman, hair wild, eyes like hers. Around her neck, a pendant, and beside her, Luna. Not drawn like an animal, drawn like something sacred. A guardian, a witness. Mason entered without a word, his face pale. He crouched beside her, pulled the photo from his jacket, and set it beside the drawing. Harper froze. She looked at it, then at her paper, then back at him. A tear slipped down her cheek, not of pain, but recognition. Luna stepped forward. Slow, deliberate, she pressed her nose to the paper, then to the photograph, then to Harper. It was all the confirmation Mason needed. She remembered, and so did Luna. The silence stretched thick and holy. Mason's jaw clenched, not from fear, from clarity. He looked at Harper. "You're not just some kid someone gave up on," he whispered, almost more to himself. "You're the thread that'll undo him." Luna exhaled behind him, and for the first time, Mason felt the full weight of what it meant to carry someone else's truth. He wasn't just hiding a girl anymore. He was carrying a war, and this time, he wasn't running from it. The envelope had no return address, no signature, no words written on the parchment tucked inside. Only a single object slipped out when Clara opened it, a silver pendant, dulled with time, the chain tangled like a trapped breath. Her fingers froze midair the moment it touched her palm. She knew this piece of metal like she knew the shape of her own hands. The world around her small town bustled, the dull clang of distant tools from the mechanic's shop, the shuffling of chairs at the cafe behind her, faded into a kind of underwater silence she was used to. But this silence pulsed with something new. Her breath hitched. It had been years since she last saw Regina Ellis, brighter than thunder, always laughing with her eyes shining faster than most could keep up. Regina was the reason Clara had ever believed the town could change, could open up, until she vanished, and no one said anything. No one looked. Because when deaf women disappear, the silence doesn't seem out of place. But now, this pendant. Clara stood in the middle of the post office lobby, the necklace cupped in her hand, shaking her head slowly, as if the motion alone might undo what she felt rising inside her chest. She bolted. The ride to the edge of the prairie was long and cracked with heat. Clara's old truck coughed and sputtered, fighting every mile like it knew this journey had weight. Her GPS didn't show the barn. It wasn't listed. Forgotten spaces don't make it into maps. But she followed the coordinates scribbled in charcoal on the back of the envelope. A language written by someone who didn't want to speak. And it led her past broken fences, rust-stained water tanks, and fields that hadn't seen cattle in years, until she saw it. The barn. Faded red paint peeled like dead bark. Wind slicing through it from every side. She parked, stepped out slowly, and then her eyes met Luna's. The mare stood a few yards off still, as stone tails swishing lightly, as if time didn't exist for her anymore. Clara didn't approach. She nodded, respectful, acknowledging something she couldn't name. Then she turned toward the barn. Inside, Harper sat hunched over a drawing. She didn't hear the truck, didn't hear the soft tread of boots against earth. But when Clara stepped into the light, something in the air shifted. Mason rose first, protective, quiet. Harper looked up and froze. Clara raised her hand slowly, not in threat but in greeting. She signed, "I knew your mother." Harper blinked. Then Clara lifted the pendant from her pocket. She signed again, slower this time. This was hers. Harper stared at it, and her lips quivered. She looked down at her own neck where the bell still hung. Then back at the pendant. Then at Clara. She stood, took a hesitant step forward, then another. She reached out. Clara didn't flinch. Harper took the pendant in both hands, held it like a piece of her own body had just been returned. Then Clara made one more sign. Quick, fluid, something small, delicate, a signature, not a name. A sign Regina used for, "I love you." A twist of the wrist, a tilt of the head, like a secret between mother and daughter. Harper's knees buckled. She didn't make a sound, but her face crumpled. Tears fell, not in drops, but in streams, like something dammed for too long had burst through. Clara dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around her. They held each other. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Mason stood off to the side, hands clenched hard, unspooling thread by thread. For weeks, he'd carried Harper's silence like a fragile relic. But watching her now, broken open in Clara's arms, he realized it wasn't silence. It was waiting for someone to see her. Really see her. Later, the three of them sat beneath the barn's only remaining skylight light, pooling on the dirt floor like spilled milk. Clara laid out papers, official ones. Printouts from county records. Regina Ellis had never been officially declared dead. Just disappeared. Closed case. No body. No inquiry. Just a quiet filing away of a woman who didn't speak in a town that didn't listen. Clara's hands moved slowly, methodically, as she signed the rest. I tried, after she vanished. They said she ran. Said she couldn't handle being a mother. Said Walter took the girl for her safety. She looked at Harper. I didn't believe them. Harper's lip trembled. Then she reached for the notebook beside her and drew three things. A bell, a necklace, and a pair of hands, making the sign for love. Clara cried then, for the first time in years. That night, as the wind howled against the barn like a beast outside a chapel, Harper stood beside Luna. She looked out into the black fields, bell resting softly against her chest, pendant clutched in her palm. She wasn't afraid. Mason stood beside her, Clara behind them. They weren't alone anymore. In town, news spread slowly. Clara made no accusations. She simply walked into the sheriff's office and placed the pendant on the desk. Then signed, "There's something you forgot to ask." The sheriff blinked, adjusted his hat, said nothing. The town was built on silence like that. Silence that protected good men who hunted, drank, and came back home at night as if they hadn't buried secrets in the fields. But Harper had changed. She no longer flinched at sudden movement. She no longer shrank from strangers. She held her pencil like a sword, now sketching not only memories, but warnings. In her drawings, Walter became smaller. Luna became larger. And in the margins, always the bell. No longer an echo of absence, now a sound of truth. Clara began teaching Harper real sign language, not just survival signs, but stories. Harper soaked it in like breath. She signed back clumsily at first, then quickly, then with fire. Mason watched in awe. Harper, the girl who had never spoken, was now telling. And the stories she told shook the silence out of everyone around her. One afternoon, Harper made a new drawing. 3 hands, one old, one rough and boyish, one small and ink-stained, all reaching toward the same bell. And below them, in bold lines, she wrote one word in big letters: enough. The next morning, Clara mailed that drawing to the courthouse, folded it into an envelope with no return address. She didn't need to sign it. The truth had a face now, and it had hands that would never be quiet again. He came in the middle of the afternoon when the heat pressed the horizon flat, and the air seemed to hum with warnings no one could quite name. The dogs barked first, low, unsettled growls echoing off the rusted tin walls of the barn. Then silence, not the peaceful kind. The kind that arrives before something breaks. Mason was the first to see the truck. The old Ford kicking up dust as it came over the ridge, weaving slowly, like it was reluctant even in its threat. He stood in the loft, pitchfork in hand, though he knew it was useless. Down below, Harper was drawing, unaware, her fingers covered in charcoal. Luna, as always, lay nearby, one eye watching the open door. Clara stepped out of the shadows, her arms folded across her chest, expression unreadable. The truck rolled to a stop just outside the fence. The engine cut. For a long minute, nothing moved. Then the driver's side door creaked open. Walter stepped out. No hat, no jacket, just boots, jeans, and a shirt that looked like it hadn't been washed in days. His eyes were the same pale gray blue as a winter sky before a storm hollow, in the way only guilt can carve someone from the inside out. He didn't call out, didn't announce himself. He just walked, deliberate, heavy, toward the barn, toward Harper. Harper heard the crunch of boots, too late. She looked up, startled by the way Luna suddenly stood. Not just stood, but blocked. Her large body moved between Harper and the door, like a living wall of memory and muscle. Harper backed up. Her bell swung, a soft chime. It was enough to freeze Walter mid-step. Mason dropped from the loft and landed hard, positioning himself in front of Luna. He didn't speak either. Just stood there, spindly arms wide, heart hammering in his throat. Clara came from the side, her footsteps firm but quiet. She didn't need words. Her presence was the statement. 3 beings, boy, horse, woman, formed a line between the old man and the child he no longer had a right to claim. Walter's eyes landed on Harper. She was taller now, not in height, but in posture. She didn't cower. She didn't cry. She stood behind Luna's shoulder, one hand resting gently on the mare's flank, the other holding the drawing she'd just finished, a picture of the 3 of them, Luna in the center, hands interlinked. Walter cleared his throat. "Came for the girl," he said. His voice sounded like dust scraping down a throat. No one moved. He shifted his stance, glanced at Clara. "She's my blood." Clara didn't blink. Instead, she raised her hand and made a single sign. "No." Mason didn't flinch. Harper's breath quickened, but she didn't step back. Luna lowered her head, her ears pinned slightly. Then, with a subtle tilt, she let the bell around her neck swing forward. The sound it made wasn't loud, not piercing, but it carried. One note, pure, whole, like a funeral bell for lies. Walter's jaw tightened. His hand fingers calloused from years of triggers, and rope shook. Just once, but they all saw it. Mason stepped forward. He didn't threaten, didn't insult, just stood there, a boy who had nothing daring a man who'd already lost everything to try and take one more thing. Luna pawed the ground once. The bell chimed again, and Walter, killer of silence, keeper of grief, stepped back. Not in fear, in recognition, not of them, of himself. The bell was no longer a memory of Regina. It was an indictment, a sound he couldn't silence, couldn't outwalk, couldn't bury under traps or whiskey or half-spoken lies. His power, once taken for granted in gunshots and orders, now unraveled by the one sound that couldn't be hunted. Truth. He looked at Harper again, and what he saw undid him. Not just a child, a mirror of what he could have saved, of who he failed. His voice broke. "I didn't mean..." But even he didn't believe it. He turned. The truck groaned as he climbed in. Dust kicked up again, but none of it reached the barn. Clara exhaled. Mason lowered his fists. Luna didn't move. Harper. Harper took one step forward. She reached up and touched the bell, then looked into the horizon where the truck had disappeared. She didn't wave. She didn't chase. She just stood there, a child no longer invisible, a survivor no longer silent. And the bell now still felt heavier than ever. Later, Mason would ask Clara what it meant, how someone could hurt their own blood and still think they were justified. She signed slowly, firmly, because silence makes them believe they can. He nodded. Then looked at Harper, who had returned to her drawing, sketching Luna not as a horse, but as a monument. He knew then they weren't just keeping her safe. They were building something. A place where no bell had to ring to be believed. A place where presence alone was power. The morning Harper left the barn for good, the air felt different, lighter somehow. As if the land itself had finally unclenched its jaw after holding back too many truths. The clouds above drifted in wide, soft layers across the sky like gauze stretched over a wound that had finally begun to close. She stood barefoot just inside the barn doors, her small suitcase beside her. It wasn't much, just a few shirts, some folded drawings, and the old silver pendant she now wore around her neck. But she carried more than what was visible. She carried something Mason didn't have words for, and maybe never would. Across from her, Luna stood in silence, as she always did, still, solid, present. Mason watched as Harper approached the mare. She reached up, untied the little brass bell from around her own neck, where it had swung through trauma, through discovery, through rebirth, and held it in her palm. The ribbon was frayed, sun-bleached and thin. The bell itself no longer looked heavy. She stroked Luna's face once, then lifted the bell slowly and looped it around the horse's neck. The ribbon slipped through her fingers with quiet grace. No ceremony, no dramatic gesture, just truth made physical. The bell rested gently against Luna's white fur. The mare didn't flinch. She bowed her head. The sound that followed wasn't sharp or cold. It was soft, round at the edges. Almost a hum, a note of peace, of choice. Mason's throat tightened. That bell had once marked Harper's survival. Now it marked her freedom. Clara waited near the gate, dressed in muted denim and wearing a satchel of books slung over her shoulder. Her eyes never left Harper. She had filed the paperwork 2 weeks earlier. No protest, no hesitation. No one in the county even tried to stop it. Maybe they knew what Mason and Luna and the land itself already understood. Harper had found where she belonged, not because of pity, because of kinship, because of language, because of recognition. Clara lived in a tight-knit deaf community outside Elgin, where the world moved at a different tempo, measured not by noise, but by attention, by eye contact, by the rhythm of hands moving through air like poetry only the heart could read. Harper would not be an anomaly there. She would be whole. The ride to Elgin was quiet. Harper pressed her forehead to the truck window, watching as the familiar world fell away. Cattle fences becoming rows of mailboxes, dirt roads bleeding into pavement. Clara didn't try to speak. She just reached over once and squeezed Harper's hand. That was enough. Meanwhile, Mason sat alone on the porch of the barn, a paper bag in his lap. Inside a sandwich Clara had made for him, his name written on the wrapper in clean, deliberate block letters. It was the first time he'd ever seen his name on something meant to be kept. A backpack sat by his feet. Inside books. Real ones. Not soggy paperbacks or torn-out pages from the trash. Actual textbooks, fresh notebooks, sharpened pencils. That morning, Clara had enrolled him at a nearby public school. "I don't got a birth certificate," Mason had whispered. She signed back, "Doesn't mean you don't exist." At exactly 9:02, the school bus appeared over the hill. Dust curled behind it like a veil. Mason slung the pack over his shoulders and walked to the edge of the property. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. But when the door opened and the driver looked down at him, Mason climbed the steps without hesitation. From the back window, just before the bus pulled away, he caught a glimpse of the barn and Luna, still standing there, bell glinting in the sun, watching. Clara's house wasn't large, but it was filled with light. Large windows, warm rugs, a wall lined with books, some written, some drawn, some only filled with blank pages for whatever Harper needed them to be. The first thing Clara taught her wasn't a word. It was rhythm. When to look, when to hold a gesture, when to trust the space between signs. At night they signed stories under the lamplight, fairy tales, memories, things Regina had once told Clara when they were young and invincible. Harper soaked it in like dry soil finally being given water. She didn't cry anymore, not in the way grief cries. She cried sometimes when she laughed. She cried once when she signed safe and realized what it meant. On the first Saturday of the month, the deaf community held a gathering in the town square. Harper stood beside Clara as hands flew through the air all around her. Greetings, jokes, questions, long-running conversations that needed no sound to live. A small girl, maybe 6, approached her. She signed, "What's that?" pointing to the silver pendant Harper wore. Harper touched it, then signed back, "My mom's." The girl smiled, then signed something slower, more careful. Harper's eyes lit up. They talked for 10 minutes, without a single sound, without a single apology. Back at the barn, Luna grazed alone. Not lonely, just unaccompanied. Sometimes the dogs came back to visit. Sometimes Mason did too after school, dropping off scraps or whispering stories about what math class felt like. But Luna no longer waited. She no longer stood guard. She simply existed. And when the wind moved through the grass in just the right way, the bell would ring. Not a warning, not a summons, just a sound to say, I was here, and I chose to stay. The birth came at dawn. No warning, no theatrics. Just a low sound, half sigh, half breath from the depths of the barn where Luna had returned to nest weeks earlier. She hadn't allowed anyone near her belly for days. She paced in circles under moonlight, not restless, but remembering. As if each step was an argument between past and present. But when the morning light cracked through the roof slats, dust glinting like gold thread in the shadows, Luna lay curled around a new life. The foal was small legs, folded awkwardly beneath him. His coat damp and pale like wet parchment. His ears twitched first, then his eyes blinked open dark and unknowing. Luna didn't whinny, didn't scream. She simply lowered her head and exhaled. No terror, no mourning, only breath, only presence. This time nothing had been taken from her. When Harper arrived, she didn't run. She didn't need to. She stepped barefoot into the barn and stopped just inside the threshold, eyes wide and glowing with something older than wonder. Luna looked up, and that was enough. Harper crossed the space quietly, slowly, as if each step respected the pain that had once lived here. When she reached the pair, the foal twitched his ears and tried to rise, toppling once before finding his legs. Luna moved slightly, nudging him forward with the curve of her nose. Harper laughed. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. She knelt, reached out one hand, and ran it gently across Luna's neck, then down to the bell. It rang once, soft, round, alive. The village had changed since the last time Harper stood in its square. It wasn't that the buildings had grown or the roads had been paved smoother. It was something else. Something beneath the surface, like the soil itself had decided to start over. Clara walked beside her. Mason trailed close, still taller than her, but no longer so afraid of being seen. People gathered in quiet lines, their heads turning toward the large wooden structure in the center of the square. The statue stood nearly 6 feet tall, carved from a single tree felled after a storm the year before. The artisan, a deaf woman named Ruth, who carved stories instead of telling them, had worked in silence for months. The final piece was unveiled beneath morning sun and soft applause. It wasn't grand in its composition. It was true. A mare head, bowed slightly. Eyes carved with gentle focus, stood in sculpted stillness, her body strong but weathered. Underneath her chest, nestled close, was a little girl, not hiding, but safe. Her hand reached up to touch the mare's chest, and between them, suspended midair, was a bell. Small, unremarkable, and eternal. On the plaque below were no names, only 3 words. I see you. Far away, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and old time, Walter Ellis sat in a wheelchair, pushed too close to a television mounted high on the wall. His hands trembled, not from illness, but from age unshielded by pride. The nurse had wheeled him in for community hour, a ritual in the nursing home meant to break the repetition of pills and silence. Today's segment was about a rural Texas town, about a statue, about a girl who survived, about a horse that refused to leave. The camera panned slowly across the square, to Harper standing in front of the carving, smiling, silent, free. Walter's fingers curled tightly around the arms of his chair, not from anger, from knowing. A single tear slipped from his left eye. It moved down the ridge of his cheek like a reluctant confession. He didn't speak, didn't call out. No one in the room noticed, but the soundless breaking of a man is louder than words. That night, back in her new room with soft lights and a window that caught the moon just right, Harper placed her newest drawing on the wall. It was the foal, but beside him, drawn in a halo of lines and soft curves, was a woman, not full-bodied, not detailed, just the outline of someone watching from a distance, hand raised in the same sign Clara had taught her once. Love. Harper reached up and touched the drawing, then turned to the window. Outside in the field beyond the fence, Luna stood grazing beside her son, the bell around her neck glinting under the stars. And for the first time in her life, Harper knew this wasn't the end of a story. This was a beginning. The sun leaned low over the rooftops of the small Texas town, casting a gold so rich it made the dust look holy. Paper lanterns swung gently above the town square, strung from post to post like whispered promises. Children ran barefoot between the legs of adults, chasing each other in spirals of laughter. Food sizzled. Smoke twisted up into the sky. But beneath the noise, something quieter pulsed in anticipation no one could name. It was the night of the Harvest of Light, a local tradition born from no particular origin. Just a desire to gather, to remember to begin again. But this year something was different. This year the story being told belonged to someone who had once lived outside the sound of things. Harper stood behind the stage curtain, small fingers tugging gently at the hem of her dress. Her hair was braided down her back, a single ribbon woven through green, the same shade as the grass where Luna first stood guard. Clara stood beside her. Calm grounded her palms open and relaxed. Her eyes asked, "Ready?" Harper nodded. The bell, now resting quietly on Luna's neck just outside the square, had not rung all evening, as if even it was holding its breath. Mason adjusted his camera lens from within the crowd, keeping Harper in frame through the shifting silhouettes of townfolk. He stood on a small crate borrowed from the bakery, holding steady, his focus absolute. He didn't speak to the people around him. He didn't need to. His eyes said everything. And behind him, a hush began to fall, one pair of clapping hands at a time, lowering one conversation after another, dimming. The mayor, a tired man with a soft gut and sincere intentions, stepped up to the mic. He looked out over the people, cleared his throat once, and said, "Tonight we don't tell our story. We listen to someone else's." He stepped aside. The light changed, and Harper walked out. She didn't wave, didn't smile. She stood in the center of the wooden stage, with her hands at her sides and her head held high. The pendant, her mother's, rested above her heart, still and shimmering. The crowd leaned in, not to hear, but to see. Clara joined her, stepping just behind Harper's shoulder, ready to translate with her hands. Harper's right hand moved first. She signed slowly with deep intention. "This is not a story you hear." Clara's voice came in a soft, grounded tone, projected just enough for everyone to feel it. "This is not a story you hear." Harper signed again. "This is a story you feel. This is a story you feel." The crowd stood motionless. Even the children stilled. Harper placed one palm flat against her chest, just over her heart. "Some of us are born into a silence that the world doesn't know how to hold. Some of us are born into a silence that the world doesn't know how to hold." She looked out at the faces watching her, not with pity, but with witness. But silence is not the same as absence. Clara's hands moved with hers, an echo and a bridge. Harper lifted her left hand and made the sign for mother. Her eyes flickered toward the lanterns above. Then, the bell. "My mother taught me that you can love someone without needing to hear them. My mother taught me that you can love someone without needing to hear them." The crowd was still. Harper stepped forward just once, and sometimes the smallest sound. She touched her fingers to her lips, then to the bell. "Is what wakes the world? Is what wakes the world." Behind the square on the far end of the field, Luna began to walk. No one led her. No rope tugged her forward. She came of her own choosing. Her body was heavier now, stronger, filled out by the months of safety and birth. Her foal legs, longer than he knew what to do with, followed close behind. The sound of her hooves didn't reach the crowd, but when she reached the edge of the square, heads turned. The whisper moved faster than language. "Luna." She stepped through the people, and they parted, not in fear, not in reverence, but in something else, something almost holy. When she reached the base of the stage, Harper turned. They looked at each other. No words, just years pressed into one gaze. Then Harper stepped down, reached out, and gently tapped the bell. It rang. The sound carried, not far, not loud, but deep. And something in the crowd broke, not from sadness, from release. From knowing they were witnessing not an ending, but a beginning. Mason didn't film this part. He lowered the camera. Tears gathered at the corners of his eyes. He let them stay. A woman beside him touched her chest. A man behind him removed his hat. A child asked softly, "Can the horse stay?" No one answered, but Luna did. She stepped forward and lay down in the grass at the edge of the square. Her foal nestled beside her. It was enough. Later that night, under the warmth of 100 paper lanterns, people gathered not to speak, but to share. In silence, they passed around pieces of bread drawings Harper had made of the mare of the foal of her mother's necklace. Some learned how to sign "thank you." Others signed "safe." Children asked to pet the foal. And Harper, she moved through them like a ripple, not a symbol, a child. Alive, whole, free. In the corner of a quiet retirement home, Walter Ellis sat in his chair facing a muted television screen. The broadcast played without sound, but the captions moved across the bottom word by word. He didn't read them. He didn't need to. He saw the image: Harper standing beside Luna, hand over heart, the bell at rest. He reached out, touched the screen, then pulled his hand back, and whispered to no one at all, "I heard it." Back in the square, the lights dimmed. Harper stood once more at the center of the crowd. She held up her hand and signed the final sentence of her story. "Not every sound is meant for ears." Clara translated, "Not every sound is meant for ears." Harper placed her hand on her chest again, her heartbeat visible in the stillness. Some sounds are only for hearts. The crowd didn't clap. They just stood and listened. As the screen faded to black, a final image appeared. A bell, floating in the dark, glinting, still. And then in white text, "Not every sound needs to be heard. Some are made to awaken the heart."